Everyone, we are back uh Thursday afternoon, 1 p.m., January 16th. We are here with our state auditor, Doug Hoffer. Introduction as to his role broadly and how he engages with this committee in different aspects of his department agency's work. And doing some high level, and I'm sure we'll get into a little bit of a conversation with the auditor. How are you, sir?
I'm well, thank you. And let me say, hats off to you and Autumn for starting within 1 minute of the scheduled time. Come on.
We are trying to do things in an efficient fashion, sir. So I appreciate that. Yeah, so I just thought I teed it up a little bit there for you. So I will let you take the helm, introduce yourself, and
Thank you
get
very
things
much.
rolling.
Thank you. Doug Hoffer, first elected in 12, took office in 13, so I've been around for a little while. I don't see any cookies or fruit on the table, which is also very different. So we can just get started. Maybe you'll do that later in the session. But some of you are new. You may well know about what my office does. A lot of people don't. So I will give you kind of a lightning round. I see on your agenda you have a lot to do today, so I won't get too deep. Historically, state auditors did the financial audit of the state, which is obviously very important and is critical these days because if you don't pass muster in the financial audit, your bond rating is going to go down. So Mike Pichak and before him Beth Pierce were very conscious of the status of the financial audit. The other major product is the so-called federal single audit. It's a compliance audit. As the role of the federal government and state government has grown and we get a lot of federal money, we obviously have to follow federal statute and rule. So those two take up a great deal of time and effort, but they're pretty much boring, notwithstanding their import, and not a lot of fun. So they're farmed out, and that's true in many states. Big states often have enough resources to do it themselves. We don't. We have to make some choices. So by farming that out, we get to do what's of most interest to me, and I think to most Vermonters, and hopefully to you, which is performance auditing. Back in the 90s, I did some work for the state auditor at the time, Ed Flanagan, and that's when the Government Auditing Standards Board, there's a party group, GASB, they understood that while the financial and compliance audits were critical, they really haven't answered all the questions until they say, well, has that money that's been appropriated by the legislature been used effectively and efficiently? That's the bottom line, it seems to me, and that's what's most interesting about the job. We get to look into every corner of state government and ask hard questions, some of which are not welcome. We make friends everywhere we go. So starting in the 90s, it took a little while to ramp up, but starting in the 90s, this office under a couple of different auditors, eventually Randy Brock kind of turned the corner, and then Tom Salmon, his successor, my predecessor, understood that that's where we need to go. So by the time I took office, it was pretty much a done deal that the staff we had were devoted almost exclusively to performance auditing. And I enjoyed that. My background was as a policy guy, so it was a good fit for me, and I enjoyed it. And I think we've added value. It's not an easy thing to do, but we have some people who are very devoted to the work. Resources. We are a small office. We have 16 positions, a couple of vacancies at the moment, 11 professional auditors. Only a few of them are CPAs. We really don't need CPAs these days for the work we do. Having said that, I'm happy to have them around because sometimes they're very helpful. Our budget is under $4 million a year. I remember the first time I went to appropriations in 13 and I followed the vice chair of AHS. And I had to laugh. I sat at the table. I said, our budget is 1 day of their budget. Nevertheless, the record is clear. Over time, we have saved the state money, identified opportunities for more savings, and so forth. So I know we add value. We are located, or were located, in that curious, cute little Victorian building across from the tax department. But we were flooded in 23, and the building's been closed ever since. As it turned out, the staff, not surprisingly to me, having worked at home as a sole proprietor for 20 years, has become comfortable working remotely. I don't know what's going to happen down the road. That's up to the fifth floor. We need a long-term plan for State Street. We'll see. But that's where we would be if we hadn't had the flood. What we do with those resources for performance audits, I mean, the people often ask, and understandably so, how do you choose audit topics? And there's a number of options available. An obvious one is the big guys, follow the money and its impact on the state. And that includes things like healthcare and education. Another would be, risk to people. We've done some interesting jobs that have nothing to do with money, but are about the protection of elders and or children. And I've really enjoyed those because they're not about the money, because we should all care about that. And I know you do. Others are about, programs or entities that haven't been audited in years. That doesn't mean they're a risk. It just means everybody gets their moment in the sun. And so forth. And I listen to the staff who have suggestions. My deputy has suggestions. Sometimes legislators do. And occasionally the governor asks us to do something. We've done a couple in the Department of Labor, which had a lot of trouble through COVID, as you may recall. And the legislature, sadly, in my view, asked us about, I don't know, 6 or 8 years ago to become a central part of tax increment financing, which is a tool for municipalities to do economic development. And the legislature said, this is complicated. We need the auditor's office to audit all the TIF districts 3 times during their life cycle. We've learned a lot. We've shared a lot with both the tax committees and VEPSI, which administers the thing, but it is an enormous drain on our resources. It's 15 to 20% of my entire staff all the time.
So quick question within the context of that, just for those of us who don't speak TIF well, what is the life cycle of a TIF?
20 to 25.
Thank you.
Do we know what it is?
Yeah, does everybody know what a TIF is?
I bet there's people that don't know what a tax increment is.
How about a quick TIF 101 auditor?
Oh dear, sorry. So many towns struggle these days to raise the money necessary to do the kind of infrastructure improvements that most people might agree would lead to more and better economic development. Whether it's roads, sidewalks, parking lots, water and wastewater, you name it, all that sort of stuff. Back in the day, when I moved to Vermont in the 80s, I lived in Burlington, it wasn't uncommon for the mayor to come to the people with the approval of the city council every couple of years and say, we need more money for the sidewalks. Will you approve an extra half penny, or whatever the case may be? And the people could be trusted to make that choice. Well, today, as you can imagine, if you're a city manager or a mayor, it's so much nicer to go to the people and say, hey, guess what? It's not going to cost you a dime. Because what they do is get permission from the voters to borrow money, but the money's going to be paid back with a new increment of revenue from the area in which you hope there will be additional economic development. But in the short term, some of the money to pay that debt, those bonds, comes from the education fund. The fund has basically become a bank. And the response from some who like this program a lot say, well, they're going to get not only that money back, but a larger increment down the road. Well, the results are mixed. Some towns do very well, some struggle. It's about how, the level of your planning and the quality and so forth. It's confusing. Although those who advocate for it would tell you it's easy. It's not easy. The people in my office are unquestionably the most knowledgeable people in the state about this. And if you all ever have questions, I would have my chief auditor come in and give you as much as you need. It's interesting. It's used all over the country, in many cases to a much greater extent than here. I think you're going to hear from the Agency of Commerce this year about expanding the program, which I urge you to be cautious. In any case, that's an unusual example of the legislature giving us sort of a broad and ongoing responsibility to audit. That's not common. We do, in statute, have the responsibility to oversee audits of sheriffs. And boy, has that been interesting over the last 4 or 5 years. We don't do it, thankfully. We hire people outside to do it, which is just the way I like it. As for the products, given that we do performance audits, they are done to what are called GAGAS standards, generally accepted government auditing standards. And that's from the so-called Yellow Book, which is produced by the GAO. And all states are obligated to meet those standards, and they're strict. And I'm happy that they are strict because it protects the integrity of the audit office, and makes certain that the reports can't be questioned. It's really kind of interesting. The quality control that is part of GAGAS and the Yellow Book means that while there may be a defensive agency secretary or commissioner, they can't question one fact in any of our reports because they've been double and triple checked, and every one of them is backed by, yes, a document. So it's great fun. It doesn't make more friends, but it means that the reports are as reliable as they can be. Results. How do we measure success? A couple of ways. One, although I don't sign the financial or the compliance audits, we oversee them. And obviously, the integrity of that process reflects on me and my office. The key for the financial and compliance audits are how many repeat findings are there? How many adverse opinions are there? And that sort of stuff. It's technical. But if you have a lot of those and they're growing, people pay attention. Wall Street pays attention. Other people pay attention. Thankfully, successive administrations, for me, it was Shumlin and now Phil Scott, they have some very bright, capable people on the fifth floor who take this really seriously, as they should. And they've developed a very good relationship with the firm we hire to do the work. My deputy sits in on all those meetings every single week, and those numbers are down over the last 10 years. So it's done well. As for our performance audits, people ask a great question: who audits you? Which is fair. As it happens, every state auditor is obligated to undergo what's referred to as a peer review every 3 years. And a national organization organizes auditors from all over the country to go to every state every 3 years and review, depends on how big the state is, in our case, usually 4 or 5 audits from the last 2 years. And they dig in pretty deep and determine whether, in fact, we have adhered to the GAGAS Yellow Book standards. And if you don't pass that review, you got problems. Nobody's going to trust your work. It's a mess. So you really need to pay attention. And that's partly why my audit managers are so careful about the final product, but it's also because they're professionals and they care about meeting their own professional standards. So that's a very broad and brief overview of what we do and how we do it, or why we do it. But I know you don't have a lot of time, but I'm really happy to answer questions if you have any. You may not, but we can do that some other time with the chair's permission.
No, of course, of course. Any questions from members at the table? Yes.
Just the auditor was saying that, at some point they could send somebody in if wanted. I don't know how important it is, but we talked about TIFs. It is a pretty big deal. And maybe if we had some extra time, it wouldn't hurt to get a little bit more.
Most of the TIF conversations happen up in economic development. Yeah. Like it is.
I'm just curious about something we wanted to expand on. Not if things weren't germane there.
And I'm not opposed to it because it is complicated, but it is an increasingly common. Auditor Hopper, it's fair to say it's becoming a more increasingly conversation around TIFs these days.
Well, there are a lot of towns who say, how come we can't have our bite at the apple, because the current statute limits the number of TIF districts.
Right, correct. And there's some have tapered off. Now there's a few more openings, right? We actually have capacity for people to enter the TIF structure with the current cap, right?
Right. I should say, I think there may be an effort on the part of the administration to persuade you and your colleagues to do something that has not been done before, but is not uncommon in some other states. Typically, as I said, the TIF revenue from the bond, or bonds plural, is used to, improve the streets, the sidewalks, whatever the case may be. There are some who would say, why don't we use some of that money, in service to actual developers? Because I know one city did that. They bought a piece of property and sold it for $1. They achieved something they wanted. I can't say otherwise. Whether that was an appropriate use of taxpayer money is another question, and whether that was appropriate. But there was a conference in the summer that VEPSI, which administers the program, invited some consultants from out of state, and they talked about how other states are addressing this program or using this program. So I wouldn't be surprised if the commissioner of DED comes in with some proposals. And to your point about commerce in the House and Senate Economic Development, it is also within the purview of the tax committees, both ways and
course,
and
yes.
finance for sure. So,
Yeah, and I think some of those conversations, I think some of those conversations with obviously with the housing needs of the state, I think some of those TIF conversations are about providing infrastructure, the sidewalks, the curb cuts, the hookups for the wastewater sewer, et cetera, et cetera. I think that's just some of the chatter I've heard.
Yeah.
I don't want to put words in people's mouths, but
Same,
yeah.
from a municipal perspective, yeah.
two thoughts. JFO on at least two occasions, and maybe there's another one coming, was required by you and your colleagues to produce a report, which is very substantial. A fellow named Graham Campbell, who has since moved and has been replaced, but they did a really good job for you. It's a lengthy read, but if you ever want to learn about TIF, one or both of those reports is a very good starting place. And because there's going to be additional conversation this session, and because my office is so burdened, frankly, by the energy and resources we have to devote to this, I've asked my chief auditor to draft a memo, which will come to you guys probably within a few weeks. And the question is, let's talk about what we've learned about TIF and share it with you. So you'll have that shortly.
Is it, Mr. Auditor, is that document something you could share with us, the TIF document you were just speaking to?
The JFO, I'll be happy to have Autumn send it to you. Yeah.
Beautiful. And did you have a question?
I did. I understood you to say that the TIF money comes from the education fund.
Well, there are two
Ish.
sources. For
Yeah.
example, if you spend the GO bond money improving your infrastructure in the defined district, and you assume, as they must for the model, that the status quo is all the money that you're ever going to get from that district in property tax, then every additional dollar, and of course, some of it would go to the municipality, as you know, some of it would go to the ed fund. That money is now available to pay off the debt and to be used for other related purposes. But it's the muni side as well as the ed fund. It's not all ed fund, but the ed fund is bigger, so there's more ed fund money than muni as a rule.
So where did that money come from prior to the ed fund? Or were there
It
no
didn't.
TIFs?
That's the program assumes, and this is really an interesting question. I'm so glad you asked. And by the way, Chairman Barranc, tell me if you need to go at any point.
No, we still have 11 minutes. You got plenty of room to run, Auditor.
Thank you. So the assumption for the program is that absent these investments, there will be no new development within the defined TIF district. Now, there are towns and small cities all over Vermont that don't have the resources, that aren't as successful in their growth as Burlington or Chittenden County or whomever. So it varies. But I live in Burlington, and I'm not ashamed to say, give me a break. Downtown Burlington was going to grow with or without TIF. There is a requirement, a so-called but-for requirement in the program, and BEPC has to approve the assertion that but for these new investments, there would be no new property tax revenue from the TIF district. Forgive me, but that's just silly. That's not real. It could be true to a large extent in some smaller towns. But I would argue, just as an aside, that if you guys like me care about helping those towns grow, then let's just have an appropriation. Let's just call it what it is. It's a grant to a town. Don't take it from the ed fund. So the point is, it didn't exist in theory before those investments. That's the magic of the but for. It says in so many words, if you don't do this, there will be no new increment of tax revenue. Now, what JFO determined, by the way, they actually ran some numbers the last time they did this, that the towns where there was sufficient data were clearly growing anyway, at different rates, obviously, not all at the same rate. So the idea that the but for is not magic is not supported by the evidence.
This drives school boards nuts. They make some wild.
Yeah, there's a lot of opinions on TIF districts, but you also have like the TIF districts themselves broadly, then you have the project-based TIFs. There's also other variables. It gets very wonky very quickly. Yeah.
That's a great question, but when people hear that, the first to see their ears go, education.
There's a lot of emotions around TIF districts.
And by the way, it's not cheap anymore. It's up to $6 or $8 million a year, monies that would go to the ed fund but do not.
Yes. Yep. No, that's a very, very good point. Any other questions from the table for the auditor? Nope.
Good word.
Thank you.
So, yeah, we're gonna shift gears at 1:30. So I think we'll just take a break for a couple of minutes. We definitely look forward to chatting with you again. We're here if you have any policy priorities to share with us at some point. So I just wanted to do the hi, how you doing today?
I appreciate that. And I will be back, by the way, with the results of our recommendation follow-up. One of the things we do every year is look back at the recommendations we've made in the audit reports that have been released and determine with evidence whether in fact these poor souls have managed to adopt our recommendations. They love it.
I love a good follow-up on the work we've done and asked for you to provide. So I look forward to that. Yes.
All right.
Have a great day.
Thank you.
Thanks. You too. Appreciate it.
And Autumn, you can take us off.